Chapter 1E of John Quincy Adams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria Casper. John Quincy Adams by John T. Morse. Chapter 1E. At noon on August 5th, 1809, records Mr. Adams, I left my house at the corner of Boylston and Nassau streets in Boston, again to make the tedious and uncomfortable voyage across the Atlantic. A miserable and dangerous time he had of it, ere on October 23rd he reached St. Petersburg. Concerning the 4 years and a half which he is now to spend in Russia, very little need be said. His active duties were of the simplest character, amounting to little more than rendering occasional assistance to American shipmasters suffering beneath the severities so often illegally inflicted by the contesting powers of Europe. But apart from the slender practical service to be done, the period must have been interesting and agreeable for him personally, for he was received and treated throughout his stay by the Emperor and his courtiers with distinguished kindness. The Emperor, who often met him walking, used to stop and chat with him, while Count Romanzoff, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, was cordial beyond the ordinary civility of diplomacy. The diary records a series of court presentations, balls, fêtes, dinners, diplomatic and other launches, display of fireworks, birthday festivities, parades, baptisms, plays, state funerals, illuminations, and Te Deums for victories. In short, every species of social gaiety and public pageant. At all these Mr. Adams was always a bidden and apparently welcome guest. It must be admitted, even by his detractors, that he was an admirable representative of the United States abroad. Having already seen much of the distinguished society of European courts, but retaining a republican simplicity which was wholly genuine and a natural part of his character, and therefore was never affected or offensive in its manifestations, he really represented the best element in the politics and society of the United States. Winning respect for himself, he won it also for the country which he represented. Thus he was able to render an indirect but essential service in cementing the kindly feeling which the Russian Empire entertained for the American Republic. Russia could then do us little good and almost no harm. Yet the friendship of a great European power had a certain moral value in those days of our national infancy. That friendship, so cordially offered, Mr. Adams was fortunately well fitted to conciliate, showing in his foreign callings a tact which did not mark him in other public relations. He was perhaps less liked by his traveling fellow countrymen than by the Russians. The paltry ambition of a certain class of Americans for introduction to high society disgusted him greatly, and he was not found an efficient ally by these would-be comrades of the Russian aristocracy. The ambition of young Americans to crowd themselves upon European courts and into the company of nobility is a very ridiculous and not a very proud feature of their character, he wrote. There is nothing, in my estimate of things, meaner than courting society, where, if admitted, it is only to be despised. He himself happily combined extensive acquirements, excellent ability, diplomatic and courtly experience, and natural independence of character, without ill-bred self-assertion, and never failed to create a good impression in the many circles into which his foreign career introduced him. The ambassadors and ministers from European powers at St. Petersburg were constantly wrangling about precedence and like petty matters of court etiquette. In all these controversies, writes Mr. Adams, I have endeavored to consider it as an affair in which I, as an American minister, had no concern, and that my only principle is to dispute upon precedence with nobody. A good-natured contempt for European follies may be read between the lines of this remark, wherein it may be said that the Monroe Doctrine is applied to court etiquette. He always made it a point to live within the meager income which the United States allowed him, but seems to have suffered no diminution of consideration for this reason. One morning, walking on the Fontanka, he met the Emperor, who said, "Monsieur Adams, il y a 100 ans que je ne vous ai vu," and then, continuing the conversation, asked me whether I intended to take a house in the country this summer. I said no. "And why so?" said he. I was hesitating upon an answer, when he relieved me from embarrassment by saying, "Peut-être sont-ce des considérations de finance?" As he said it with perfect good humor and with a smile, I replied in the same manner, "Mais, sire, elles y sont pour un bon part." Note: An interesting sketch of his household and its expenses is to be found in volume 2 of the Diary, page 193. The volume of the journal which records this residence in St. Petersburg is very interesting as a picture of Russian life and manners in high society. Few travelers write anything nearly so vivid, so thorough, or so trustworthy as these entries. Moreover, during the whole period of his stay, the great wars of Napoleon were constantly increasing the astonishment of mankind, and created intense excitement at the court of Russia. These feelings waxed stronger as it grew daily more likely that the Emperor would have to take his turn also as a party defendant in the great conflict. Then at last came the fact of war, the invasion of Russia, the burning of Moscow, the disastrous retreat of the invaders, ending in ignominious flight, the advance of the Allies, finally the capture of Paris. All this while Mr. Adams at St. Petersburg witnessed first the alarm and then the exultation of the court and the people, as the rumors, now of defeat, anon of victory, were brought by the courtiers at tantalizing intervals, and he saw the rejoicings and illuminations which rendered the Russian capital so brilliant and glorious during the last portion of his residence. It was an experience well worth having, and which is pleasantly depicted in the diary. In September, 1812, Count Romanzoff suggested to Mr. Adams the readiness of the Emperor to act as mediator in bringing about peace between the United States and England. The suggestion was promptly acted upon, but with no directly fortunate results. The American government acceded at once to the proposition, and at the risk of an impolitic display of readiness, dispatched Messrs. Gallatin and Bayard to act as commissioners jointly with Mr. Adams in the negotiations. These gentlemen, however, arrived in St. Petersburg only to find themselves in a very awkward position. Their official character might not properly be considered as attaching unless England should accept the offer of mediation. But England had refused in the first instance to do this, and she now again reiterated her refusal without regard for the manifestation of willingness on the part of the United States. Further, Mr. Gallatin's nomination was rejected by the Senate after his departure, on the ground that his retention of the post of Secretary of the Treasury was incompatible under the Constitution with this diplomatic function. So the United States appeared in a very annoying attitude. Her commissioners were uncomfortable and somewhat humiliated. Russia felt a certain measure of vexation at the brusque and positive rejection of her friendly proposition on the part of Great Britain, and that country alone came out of the affair with any self-satisfaction. But by the time when all hopes of peace through the friendly offices of Russia were at an end, that stage of the conflict had been reached at which both parties were quite ready to desist. The United States, though triumphing in some brilliant naval victories, had been having a sorry experience on land, where, as the Russian minister remarked, England did as she pleased. A large portion of the people were extremely dissatisfied, and it was impossible to ignore that the outlook did not promise better fortunes in the future than had been encountered in the past. On the other hand, England had nothing substantial to expect from a continuance of the struggle, except heavy additional expenditure, which it was not then the fashion to compel the worsted party to recoup. She accordingly intimated her readiness to send commissioners to Göttingen, for which place Ghent was afterwards substituted, to meet American commissioners and settle terms of pacification. The United States renewed the powers of Messrs. Adams, Bayard, and Gallatin, a new Secretary of the Treasury having in the meantime been appointed, and added Jonathan Russell, then Minister to Sweden, and Henry Clay. England deputed Lord Gambier, an admiral, Dr. Adams, a publicist, and Mr. Goulburn, a member of Parliament and Under Secretary of State. These 8 gentlemen accordingly met in Ghent on August 7th, 1814. It was upwards of 4 months before an agreement was reached. During this period Mr. Adams kept his diary with much more even than his wonted faithfulness, and it undoubtedly presents the most vivid picture in existence of the labors of treaty‐making diplomatists. The 8 were certainly an odd assemblage of peacemakers. The ill blood and wranglings between the opposing commissions were bad enough, yet hardly equaled the intestine dissensions between the American commissioners themselves. That the spirit of peace should ever have emanated from such a universal embroilment is almost sufficiently surprising to be regarded as a miracle. At the very beginning, or even before fairly beginning, the British party roused the jealous ire of the Americans by proposing that they all should meet for exchanging their full powers at the lodgings of the Englishmen. The Americans took fire at this offensive pretension to superiority, which was the usage from ambassadors to ministers of an inferior order. Mr. Adams cited Martins, and Mr. Bayard read a case from Ward's Law of Nations. Mr. Adams suggested sending a pointed reply, agreeing to meet the British commissioners at any place other than their own lodgings. But Mr. Gallatin, whose valuable function was destined to be the keeping of the peace among his fractious colleagues, as well as betwixt them and the Englishmen, substituted the milder phrase, "at any place which may be mutually agreed upon." The first meeting accordingly took place at the Hôtel des Pays-Bas, where it was arranged that the subsequent conferences should be held alternately at the quarters of the 2 commissions. Then followed expressions, conventional and proper, but wholly untrue, of mutual sentiments of esteem and goodwill. No sooner did the gentlemen begin to get seriously at the work before them than the most discouraging prospects were developed. The British first presented their demands as follows: 1. That the United States should conclude a peace with the Indian allies of Great Britain, and that a species of neutral belt of Indian territory should be established between the dominions of the United States and Great Britain, so that these dominions should be nowhere conterminous, upon which belt or barrier neither power should be permitted to encroach even by purchase, and the boundaries of which should be settled in this treaty. 2. That the United States should keep no naval force upon the Great Lakes, and should neither maintain their existing forts nor build new ones upon their northern frontier. It was even required that the boundary line should run along the southern shore of the lakes, while no corresponding restriction was imposed upon Great Britain, because she was stated to have no projects of conquest as against her neighbor. 3. That a piece of the province of Maine should be ceded in order to give the English a road from Halifax to Quebec. 4. That the stipulation of the treaty of 1783, conferring on English subjects the right of navigating the Mississippi, should be now formally renewed. The Americans were astounded. It seemed to them hardly worth while to have come so far to listen to such propositions. Concerning the proposed Indian pacification they had not even any powers, the United States being already busied in negotiating a treaty with the tribes as independent powers. The establishment of the neutral Indian belt was manifestly contrary to the established policy and obvious destiny of the nation. Neither was the answer agreeable which was returned by Dr. Adams to the inquiry as to what was to be done with those citizens of the United States who had already settled in those parts of Michigan, Illinois, and Ohio included within the territory which it was now proposed to make inalienably Indian. He said that these people, amounting to perhaps 100,000, must shift for themselves. The one-sided disarmament upon the lakes and along the frontier was, by the understanding of all nations, such an humiliation as is inflicted only on a crushed adversary. No return was offered for the road between Halifax and Quebec, nor for the right of navigating the Mississippi. The treaty of peace of 1783, made in ignorance of the topography of the unexplored northern country, had established an impossible boundary line running from the Lake of the Woods westward along the 49th parallel to the Mississippi, and as appurtenant to the British territory thus supposed to touch the river, a right of navigation upon it was given. It had since been discovered that a line on that parallel would never touch the Mississippi. The same treaty had also secured for the United States certain rights concerning the northeastern fisheries. The English now insisted upon a reaffirmance of the privilege given to them without a reaffirmance of the privilege given to the United States, ignoring the fact that the recent acquisition of Louisiana, making the Mississippi wholly American, materially altered the propriety of a British right of navigation upon it. Apart from the intolerable character of these demands, the personal bearing of the English commissioners did not tend to mitigate the chagrin of the Americans. The formal civilities had counted with the American commissioners for more than they were worth, and had induced them, in preparing a long dispatch to the home government, to insert a paragraph complimentary to the personal deportment of the British. But before they sent off the document they revised it and struck out these pleasant phrases. Not many days after the first conference, Mr. Adams notes that the tone of the English commissioners was even more peremptory, and their language more overbearing than at the former conferences. A little farther on he remarks that the British note is overbearing and insulting in its tone, like the two former ones. Again he says, "The tone of all the British notes is arrogant, overbearing, and offensive. The tone of ours is neither so bold nor so spirited as I think it should be. It is too much on the defensive, and too excessive in the caution to say nothing irritating. I have seldom been able to prevail upon my colleagues to insert anything in the style of retort upon the harsh and reproachful matter which we receive." Many little passages at arms in the conferences are recited which amply bear out these remarks as regards both parties. Perhaps, however, it should be admitted that the Americans made up for the self-restraint which they practiced in conference by the disagreements and bickerings in which they indulged when consulting among themselves. Mr. Gallatin's serene temper and cool head were hardly taxed to keep the peace among his excited colleagues. Mr. Adams and Mr. Clay were especially prone to suspicions and to outbursts of anger. Mr. Adams often and candidly admits as much of himself, apparently not without good reason. At first the onerous task of drafting the numerous documents which the commission had to present devolved upon him, a labor for which he was well fitted in all respects save perhaps a tendency to prolixity. He did not, however, succeed in satisfying his comrades, and the criticisms to which they subjected his composition galled his self-esteem severely, so much so that ere long he altogether relinquished this function, which was thereafter performed chiefly by Mr. Gallatin. As early as August 21st, Mr. Adams says, not without evident bitterness, that though they all were agreed on the general view of the subject, yet in his exposition of it one objects to the form, another to the substance of almost every paragraph. Mr. Gallatin would strike out everything possibly offensive to the Englishman. Mr. Clay would draw his pen through every figurative expression. Mr. Russell, not content with agreeing to all the objections of both the others, would further amend the construction of every sentence, and finally Mr. Bayard would insist upon writing all over again in his own language. All this nettled Mr. Adams exceedingly. On September 24th he again writes that it was agreed to adopt an article which he had drawn, though with objections to almost every word which he had used. "This," he says, "is a severity with which I alone am treated in our discussions by all my colleagues. Almost everything written by any of the rest is rejected or agreed to with very little criticism, verbal or substantial. But every line that I write passes a gauntlet of objections by every one of my colleagues, which finally issues for the most part in the rejection of it all." He reflects with a somewhat forced air of self-discipline that this must indicate some faultiness in his composition which he must try to correct. But in fact it is sufficiently evident that he was seldom persuaded that his papers were improved. Amid all this we see in the diary many exhibitions of vexation. One day he acknowledges, "I cannot always restrain the irritability of my temper." Another day he informed his colleagues, with too much warmth, that they might be assured I was as determined as they were. Again he reflects, "I too must not forget to keep a constant guard upon my temper, for the time is evidently approaching when it will be wanted. Mr. Gallatin alone seems not to have exasperated him. Mr. Clay and he were constantly in discussion, and often pretty hotly. Instead of coming nearer together, as time went on these two fell farther apart. What Mr. Clay thought of Mr. Adams may probably be inferred from what we know that Mr. Adams thought of Mr. Clay. "Mr. Clay is losing his temper and growing peevish and fractious," he writes on October 31st, and constantly he repeats the like complaint. The truth is that the precise New Englander and the impetuous Westerner were kept asunder not only by local interests, but by habits and modes of thought utterly dissimilar. Some amusing glimpses of their private life illustrate this difference. Mr. Adams worked hard and diligently, allowing himself little leisure for pleasure, but Mr. Clay, without actually neglecting his duties, yet managed to find ample time for enjoyment. More than once Mr. Adams notes that as he rose about 5 o'clock in the morning to light his own fire and begin the labors of the day by candle light, he heard the parties breaking up and leaving Mr. Clay's rooms across the entry, where they had been playing cards all night long. In these little touches one sees the distinctive characters of the men well portrayed. The very extravagance of the British demands at least saved the Americans from perplexity. Mr. Clay, indeed, cherished an inconceivable idea that the Englishmen would finish by receding from the ground they had taken, but meantime there could be no difference of opinion concerning the impossibility of meeting them upon that ground. Mr. Adams, never lacking in courage, actually wished to argue with them that it would be for the interests of Great Britain, not less than of the United States, if Canada should be ceded to the latter power. Unfortunately his colleagues would not support him in this audacious policy, the humor of which is delicious. It would have been infinitely droll to see how the British commissioners would have hailed such a proposition, by way of appropriate termination of a conflict in which the forces of their nation had captured and ransacked the capital city of the Americans. End of chapter 1E. Chapter 1F of John Quincy Adams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria Casper. John Quincy Adams by John T. Morse. Chapter 1F. On August 21st the Englishmen invited the Americans to dinner on the following Saturday. "The chance is," wrote Mr. Adams, "that before that time the whole negotiation will be at an end." The banquet, however, did come off, and a few more succeeded it, feasts not marked by any great geniality or warmth, except perhaps occasionally warmth of discussion. So sure were the Americans that they were about to break off the negotiations, that Mr. Adams began to consider by what route he should return to St. Petersburg, and they declined to renew the tenure of their quarters for more than a few days longer. Like alarms were of frequent occurrence, even almost to the very day of agreement. On September 15th, at a dinner given by the American commissioners, Lord Gambier asked Mr. Adams whether he would return immediately to St. Petersburg. "Yes," replied Mr. Adams, "that is, if you send us away." His lordship replied with assurances, how deeply he lamented it, and with a hope that we should one day be friends again. On the same occasion Mr. Goulburn said that probably the last note of the Americans would terminate the business, and that they must fight it out. Fighting it out was a much less painful prospect for Great Britain just at that juncture than for the United States, as the Americans realized with profound anxiety. "We so fondly cling to the vain hope of peace that every new proof of its impossibility operates upon us as a disappointment," wrote Mr. Adams. No amount of pride could altogether conceal the fact that the American commissioners represented the worsted party, and though they never openly said so, even among themselves, yet indirectly they were obliged to recognize the truth. On November 10th we find Mr. Adams proposing to make concessions not permitted by their instructions, because, as he said, "I felt so sure that the home government would now gladly take the state before the war as the general basis of the peace, that I was prepared to take on me the responsibility of trespassing upon their instructions thus far. Not only so, but I would at this moment cheerfully give my life for a peace on this basis. If peace was possible, it would be on no other. I had indeed no hope that the proposal would be accepted." Mr. Clay thought that the British would laugh at this. They would say, "Aye, aye, pretty fellows you, to think of getting out of the war as well as you got into it." This was not consoling for the representatives of that side which had declared war for the purpose of curing grievances and vindicating alleged rights. But that Mr. Adams correctly read the wishes of the government was proved within a very few days by the receipt of express authority from home to conclude the peace on the basis of the status ante bellum. 3 days afterwards, on November 27th, 3½ months after the vexatious haggling had been begun, we encounter in the Diary the first real gleam of hope of a successful termination. All the difficulties to the conclusion of a peace appear to be now so nearly removed that my colleagues all consider it as certain. I myself think it probable. There were, however, some 3 weeks more of negotiation to be gone through before the consummation was actually achieved, and the ill blood seemed to increase as the end was approached. The differences between the American commissioners waxed especially serious concerning the fisheries and the navigation of the Mississippi. Mr. Adams insisted that if the treaty of peace had been so far abrogated by the war as to render necessary a reaffirmance of the British right of navigating the Mississippi, then a reaffirmance of the American rights in the northeastern fisheries was equally necessary. This the English commissioners denied. Mr. Adams said it was only an exchange of privileges, presumably equivalent. Mr. Clay, however, was firmly resolved to prevent all stipulations admitting such a right of navigation, and the better to do so, he was quite willing to let the fisheries go. The navigation privilege he considered much too important to be conceded for a mere liberty of drying fish upon a desert, as he was pleased to describe a right for which the United States has often been ready to go to war, and may yet sometime do so. "Mr. Clay lost his temper," writes Mr. Adams a day or two later, "as he generally does whenever this right of the British to navigate the Mississippi is discussed. He was utterly averse to admitting it as an equivalent for a stipulation securing the contested part of the fisheries. He said the more he heard of this, the right of fishing, the more convinced he was that it was of little or no value. He should be glad to get it if he could, but he was sure the British would not ultimately grant it. That the navigation of the Mississippi, on the other hand, was an object of immense importance, and he could see no sort of reason for granting it as an equivalent for the fisheries." Thus spoke the representative of the West. The New Englander, the son of the man whose exertions had been chiefly instrumental in originally obtaining the grant of the northeastern fishery privileges, naturally went to the other extreme. He thought the British right of navigating the Mississippi to be as nothing, considered as a grant from us. It was secured to them by the peace of 1783. They had enjoyed it at the commencement of the war. It had never been injurious in the slightest degree to our own people, and it appeared to him that the British claim to it was just and equitable. Further, he believed the right to this navigation to be a very useless thing to the British, but their national pride and honor were interested in it. The government could not make a peace which would abandon it. The fisheries, however, Mr. Adams regarded as one of the most inestimable and inalienable of American rights. It is evident that the United States could ill have spared either Mr. Adams or Mr. Clay from the negotiation, and the joinder of the two, however fraught with discomfort to themselves, well served substantial American interests. Mr. Adams thought the British perfidious, and suspected them of not entertaining any honest intention of concluding a peace. On December 12th, after an exceedingly quarrelsome conference, he records his belief that the British have insidiously kept open 2 points for the sake of finally breaking off the negotiations and making all their other concessions proofs of their extreme moderation, to put upon us the blame of the rupture. On December 11th we find Mr. Clay ready for a war 3 years longer, and anxious to begin to play at brag with the Englishmen. His colleagues, more complacent or having less confidence in their own skill in that game, found it difficult to placate him. He stalked to and fro across the chamber, repeating 5 or 6 times, "I will never sign a treaty upon the status ante bellum with the Indian article, so help me God." The next day there was an angry controversy with the Englishmen. The British troops had taken and held Moose Island in Passamaquoddy Bay, the rightful ownership of which was in dispute. The title was to be settled by arbitrators, but the question whether the British should restore possession of the island pending the arbitration aroused bitter discussion. Mr. Goulburn and Dr. Adams, the Englishman, immediately took fire, and Goulburn lost all control of his temper. "He has always in such cases," says the diary, "a sort of convulsive agitation about him, and the tone in which he speaks is more insulting than the language which he uses." Mr. Bayard referred to the case of the Falkland Islands. "Why," in a transport of rage, said Goulburn, "in that case we sent a fleet and troops and drove the fellows off, and that is what we ought to have done in this case." Mr. J.Q. Adams, whose extensive and accurate information more than once annoyed his adversaries, stated that, as he remembered it, the Spaniards in that case had driven the British off, and Lord Gambier helped his blundering colleague out of the difficulty by suggesting a new subject, much as the defeated heroes of the Iliad used to find happy refuge from death in a God-sent cloud of dust. It is amusing to read that in the midst of such scenes as these the show of courtesy was still maintained, and on December 13th the Americans all dined with the British plenipotentiaries, though the party was more than usually dull, stiff, and reserved. It was certainly forcing the spirit of good fellowship. The next day Mr. Clay notified his colleagues that they were going to make a damned bad treaty, and he did not know whether he would sign it or not. And Mr. Adams also said that he saw that the rest had made up their minds at last to yield the fishery point, in which case he also could not sign the treaty. On the following day, however, the Americans were surprised by receiving a note from the British commissioners, wherein they made the substantial concession of omitting from the treaty all reference to the fisheries and the navigation of the Mississippi. But Mr. Clay, on reading the note, manifested some chagrin, and still talked of breaking off the negotiation, even asking Mr. Adams to join him in so doing, which request, however, Mr. Adams very reasonably refused. Mr. Clay had also been anxious to stand out for a distinct abandonment of the alleged right of impressment, but upon this point he found none of his colleagues ready to back him, and he was compelled perforce to yield. Agreement was therefore now substantially reached. A few minor matters were settled, and on December 24th, 1814, the treaty was signed by all the 8 negotiators. It was an astonishing as well as a happy result. Never probably in the history of diplomacy has concord been produced from such discordant elements as had been brought together in Ghent. Dissension seemed to have become the mother of amity, and antipathies were mere preliminaries to a good understanding. In diplomacy, as in marriage, it had worked well to begin with a little aversion. But in truth this consummation was largely due to what had been going on in the English cabinet. At the outset Lord Castlereagh had been very unwilling to conclude peace, and his disposition had found expression in the original intolerable terms prepared by the British commissioners. But Lord Liverpool had been equally solicitous on the other side, and was said even to have tendered his resignation to the Prince Regent if an accommodation should not be effected. His endeavors were fortunately aided by events in Europe. Pending the negotiations, Lord Castlereagh went on a diplomatic errand to Vienna, and there fell into such threatening discussions with the Emperor of Russia and the King of Prussia that he thought it prudent to have done with the American war, and wrote home pacific advices. Hence at last came such concessions as satisfied the Americans. The treaty established a firm and universal peace between His Britannic Majesty and the United States. Each party was to restore all captured territory, except that the islands of which title was in dispute were to remain in the occupation of the party holding them at the time of ratification until that title should be settled by commissioners. Provision was made also for the determination of all the open questions of boundary by sundry boards of commissioners. Each party was to make peace with the Indian allies of the other. Such were in substance the only points touched upon by this document. Of the many subjects mooted between the negotiators, scarcely any had survived the fierce contests which had been waged concerning them. The whole matter of the navigation of the Mississippi, access to that river, and a road through American territory had been dropped by the British, while the Americans had been well content to say nothing of the northeastern fisheries, which they regarded as still their own. The disarmament on the lakes and along the Canadian border, and the neutralization of a strip of Indian territory, were yielded by the English. The Americans were content to have nothing said about impressment, nor was any one of the many illegal rights exercised by England formally abandoned. The Americans satisfied themselves with the reflection that circumstances had rendered these points now only matters of abstract principle, since the pacification of Europe had removed all opportunities and temptations for England to persist in her previous objectionable courses. For the future it was hardly to be feared that she would again undertake to pursue a policy against which it was evident that the United States were willing to conduct a serious war. There was, however, no provision for indemnification. Upon a fair consideration, it must be admitted that though the treaty was silent upon all the points which the United States had made war for the purpose of enforcing, yet the country had every reason to be gratified with the result of the negotiation. The 5 commissioners had done themselves ample credit. They had succeeded in agreeing with each other. They had avoided any fracture of a negotiation which up to the very end seemed almost daily on the verge of being broken off in anger. They had managed really to lose nothing, in spite of the fact that their side had decidedly the worst of the struggle. They had negotiated much more successfully than the armies of their countrymen had fought. The Marquis of Wellesley said in the House of Lords that in his opinion the American commissioners had shown a most astonishing superiority over the British during the whole of the correspondence. One cannot help wishing that the battle of New Orleans had taken place a little earlier, or that the negotiation had fallen a little later, so that news of that brilliant event could have reached the ears of the insolent Englishmen at Ghent, who had for 3 months been enjoying the malicious pleasure of lending to the Americans English newspapers containing accounts of American misfortunes. But that fortunate battle was not fought until a few days after the 8 commissioners had signed their compact. It is an interesting illustration of the slowness of communication which our forefathers had to endure, that the treaty crossed the Atlantic in a sailing ship in time to travel through much of the country simultaneously with the report of this farewell victory. 2 such good pieces of news coming together set the people wild with delight. Even on the dry pages of Niles' Weekly Register occurs the triumphant paragraph: "Who would not be an American? Long live the Republic! All hail! Last asylum of oppressed humanity! Peace is signed in the arms of victory." It was natural that most of the ecstasy should be manifested concerning the military triumph, and that the mass of the people should find more pleasure in glorifying General Jackson than in exalting the commissioners. The value of their work, however, was well proved by the voice of Great Britain. In the London Times of December 30th appeared a most angry tirade against the treaty, with bitter sneers at those who called the peace an honorable one. England, it was said, had attempted to force her principles on America and had failed. Foreign powers would say that the English had retired from the combat with the stripes yet bleeding on their backs, with the recent defeats at Plattsburg and on Lake Champlain unavenged. The most gloomy prognostications of further wars with America, when her naval power should have waxed much greater, were indulged. The loss of prestige in Europe, the probable loss of our transatlantic provinces, were among the results to be anticipated from this treaty into which the English commissioners had been beguiled by the Americans. These latter were reviled with an abuse which was really the highest compliment. The family name of Mr. Adams gained no small access of distinction in England from this business. After the conclusion of the treaty, Mr. Adams went to Paris and remained there until the middle of May, 1815, thus having the good fortune to witness the return of Napoleon and a great part of the events of the famous 100 Days. On May 26th he arrived in London, where there awaited him in the hands of the Barings his commission as envoy extraordinary and minister plenipotentiary to Great Britain. His first duty was, in connection with Mr. Clay and Mr. Gallatin, to negotiate a treaty of commerce, in which business he again met the same 3 British commissioners by whom the negotiations at Ghent had been conducted, of whose abilities the government appeared to entertain a better opinion than the Marquis of Wellesley had expressed. This negotiation had been brought so far towards conclusion by his colleagues before his own arrival, that Mr. Adams had little to do in assisting them to complete it. This little having been done, they departed and left him as minister at the court of St. James. Thus he fulfilled Washington's prophecy by reaching the highest rank in the American diplomatic service. Of his stay in Great Britain little need be said. He had few duties of importance to perform. The fisheries, the right of impressment, and the taking away and selling of slaves by British naval officers during the late war formed the subjects of many interviews between him and Lord Castlereagh, without, however, any definite results being reached. But he succeeded in obtaining, towards the close of his stay, some slight remission of the severe restrictions placed by England upon our trade with her West Indian colonies. His relations with a cabinet in which the principles of Castlereagh and Canning predominated could hardly be cordial, yet he seems to have been treated with perfect civility. Indeed, he was not a man whom it was easy even for an Englishman to insult. He remarks of Castlereagh, after one of his first interviews with that nobleman: "His deportment is sufficiently graceful, and his person is handsome. His manner was cold, but not absolutely repulsive." Before he left he had had the pleasure of having Mr. Canning specially seek acquaintance with him. He met of course many distinguished and many agreeable persons during his residence, and partook of many festivities, especially of numerous civic banquets at which toasts were formally given in the dullest English fashion, and he was obliged to display his capacity for tablecloth oratory, as he called it, more than was agreeable to him. He was greatly bored by these solemn and pompous feedings. Partly in order to escape them, he took a house at Ealing, and lived there during the greater part of his stay in England. "One of the strongest reasons for my remaining out of town," he writes, "is to escape the frequency of invitations at late hours, which consume so much precious time, and with the perpetually mortifying consciousness of inability to return the civility in the same manner." The republican simplicity, not to say poverty, forced upon American representatives abroad, was a very different matter in the censorious and unfriendly society of London from what it had been at the kindly disposed court of St. Petersburg. The relationship between the mother country and the quondam colonies, especially at that juncture, was such as to render social life intolerably trying to an underpaid American minister. Mr. Adams remained in England until June 15th, 1817, when he sailed from Cowes, closing forever his long and honorable diplomatic career, and bidding his last farewell to Europe. He returned home to take the post of Secretary of State in the Cabinet of James Monroe, then lately inaugurated as President of the United States. End of Chapter 1F.
Chapter 2A of John Quincy Adams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. John Quincy Adams by John T. Morse. Chapter 2A. Secretary of State and President. From the capitals of Russia and Great Britain to the capital of the United States was a striking change. Washington, in its early struggle for existence, was so unattractive a spot that foreigners must have been at a loss to discover the principle which had governed the selection. It combined all the ugliness with all the discomfort of an unprosperous frontier settlement on an ill-chosen site. What must European diplomats have thought of a capital city where snakes 2 feet long invaded gentlemen's drawing-rooms, and a carriage, bringing home the guests from a ball, could be upset by the impenetrable depth of quagmire at the very door of a foreign minister's residence? A description of the city given by Mr. Mills, a representative from Massachusetts in 1815, is pathetic in its unutterable horror. "It is impossible," he writes, "for me to describe to you my feelings on entering this miserable desert, this scene of desolation and horror. My anticipations were almost infinitely short of the reality, and I can truly say that the first appearance of this seat of the national government has produced in me nothing but absolute loathing and disgust." If the place wore such a dreadful aspect to the simple denizen of a New England country town, what must it have seemed to those who were familiar with London and Paris? To them the social life must have been scarcely less dreary than the rest of the surroundings. Accordingly, with this change of scene, the diary, so long a record of festivities, sometimes dull and formal, but generally collecting interesting and distinguished persons, ceases almost wholly to refer to topics of society. Yet, of course, even the foul streets could not prevent people from occasionally meeting together. There were simple tea drinkings, stupid weekly dinners at the President's, infrequent receptions by Mrs. Monroe, card parties and conversation parties, which at the British ministers were very elegant, and at the French ministers were more gay. Monsieur de Neuville, at his dinners, used to puzzle and astound the plain living Yankees by serving dishes of turkeys without bones, and puddings in the form of fowls, fresh cod disguised like a salad, and celery like oysters. Further, he scandalized some and demoralized others by having dancing on Saturday evenings, which the New England ladies had been educated to consider as holy time. Mr. and Mrs. Adams used to give weekly parties on Tuesday evenings, and apparently many persons stood not a little in awe of these entertainments, and of the givers of them, by reason of their superior familiarity with the manners and customs of the best society of Europe. Mrs. Adams was, on the whole, a very pleasant and agreeable woman, but the secretary had no talent to entertain a mixed company, either by conversation or manners. Thus writes this same Mr. Mills, whose sentiments toward Mr. Adams were those of respect rather than of personal liking. Their favorite dissipation then consisted in card playing, and the stakes were all too often out of just proportion to the assets of the gamesters. At one time Mr. Clay was reputed to have lost $8,000, an amount so considerable for him as to weigh upon his mind to the manifest detriment of his public functions. But sometimes the gentlemen resident in the capital met for purposes less innocent than Saturday evening cotillions, or even the extravagant betting at the card table, and stirred the dullness of society by a duel. Mr. Adams tells of one affair of this sort, fought between ex-Senator Mason of Virginia and his cousin, wherein the weapons used were muskets, and the distance was only 6 paces. Mason was killed, his cousin was wounded, and only by a lucky accident escaped with his life. Mr. Adams had little time and less taste for either the amusements or the dangers thus offered to him. He preferred to go to bed in good season, to get up often long before daybreak, and to labor assiduously the livelong day. His favorite exercise was swimming in the Potomac, where he accomplished feats which would have been extraordinary for a young and athletic man. The most important, perplexing, and time-consuming duties then called for by the condition of public affairs happened to fall within Mr. Adams's department. Monroe's administration had been christened the era of good feeling, and so far as political divisions among the people at large were concerned, this description is correct enough. There were no great questions of public policy dividing the nation. There could hardly be said to be two political parties. With the close of the war the malcontent Federalists had lost the only substantial principle upon which they had been able to vigorously oppose the administration, and as a natural consequence the party rapidly shrank to insignificant proportions, and became of hardly more importance than were the Jacobites in England after their last hopes had been quenched by the failure of the rebellion of '45. The Federalist faith, like Jacobitism, lingered in a few neighborhoods, and was maintained by a few old families, who managed to associate it with a sense of their own pride and dignity. But as an effective opposition or influential party organization it was effete, and no successor was rising out of its ruins. In a broad way, therefore, there was political harmony to a very remarkable degree. But among individuals there was by no means a prevailing good feeling. Not held together by the pressure exerted by the antagonism of a strong hostile force, the prominent men of the Cabinet and in Congress were busily employed in promoting their own individual interests, having no great issues with which to identify themselves, and upon which they could openly and honorably contend for the approval of the nation. Their only means for securing their respective private ends lay in secretly overreaching and supplanting each other. Infinite skill was exerted by each to inveigle his rival into an unpopular position or a compromising light. By series of precedents, Mr. Adams, as Secretary of State, appeared most prominent as a candidate for the succession to the presidency, but Mr. Crawford, in the Treasury Department, had been very near obtaining the nomination instead of Monroe, and he was firmly resolved to secure it so soon as Mr. Monroe's 8 years should have elapsed. He therefore, finding much leisure left upon his hands by the not very exacting business of his office, devoted his ingenuity to devising schemes for injuring the prestige of Mr. Adams. Mr. Clay also had been greatly disappointed that he had not been summoned to be Secretary of State, and so made heir apparent. His personal enmity was naturally towards Mr. Monroe; his political enmity necessarily also included Mr. Adams, whose appointment he had privately sought to prevent. He therefore at once set himself assiduously to oppose and thwart the administration, and to make it unsuccessful and unpopular. That Clay was in the main and upon all weighty questions an honest statesman and a real patriot must be admitted; but just at this period no national crisis called his nobler qualities into action, and his course was largely influenced by selfish considerations. It was not long before Mr. Calhoun also entered the lists, though in a manner less discreditable to himself personally than were the resources of Crawford and Clay. The daily narrations and comments of Mr. Adams display and explain in a manner highly instructive, if not altogether agreeable, the ambitions and the manoeuvres, the hollow alliances and unworthy intrigues, not only of these three, but also of many other estimable gentlemen then in political life. The difference between those days and our own seems not so great as the laudatores temporis acti are wont to proclaim it. The elaborate machinery which has since been constructed was then unknown. Rivals relied chiefly upon their own astuteness and the aid of a few personal friends and adherents for carrying on contests and attaining ends which are now sought by vastly more complex methods. What the stagecoach of that period was to the railroads of to-day, or what the hand-loom was to our great cotton mills, such also was the political intriguing of cabinet ministers, senators, and representatives to our present party machinery. But the temper was no better, honor was no keener, and the sense of public duty was little more disinterested than now. One finds no serious traces of vulgar financial dishonesty recorded in these pages, in which Mr. Adams was handed down the political life of the second and third decades of our century with photographic accuracy; but one does not see a much higher level of faithfulness to ideal standards in political life than now exists. As has been said, it so happened that in Mr. Monroe's administration the heaviest burden of labor and responsibility rested upon Mr. Adams. The most important and most perplexing questions fell within his department. Domestic breaches had been healed, but foreign breaches gaped with threatening jaws. War with Spain seemed imminent. Her South American colonies were then waging their contest for independence, and naturally looked to the late successful rebels of the northern continent for acts of neighborly sympathy and good fellowship. Their efforts to obtain official recognition and the exchange of ministers with the United States were eager and persistent. Privateers fitted out at Baltimore gave the State Department scarcely less cause for anxiety than the shipbuilders of Liverpool gave to the English cabinet in 1863 64. These perplexities, as is well known, caused the passage of the first Neutrality Act, which first formulated and has since served to establish the principle of international obligation in such matters, and has been the basis of all subsequent legislation upon the subject not only in this country but also in Great Britain. The European powers, impelled by a natural distaste for rebellion by colonists, and also believing that Spain would in time prevail over the insurgents, turned a deaf ear to South American agents. But in the United States it was different. Here it was anticipated that the revolted communities were destined to win. Mr. Adams records this as his own opinion, besides which there was also a natural sympathy felt by our people in such a conflict in their own quarter of the globe. Nevertheless, in many anxious cabinet discussions, the President and the Secretary of State established the policy of reserve and caution. Rebels against an established government are like plaintiffs in legislation. The burden of proof is upon them, and the neutral nations, who are a sort of quasi-jurors, must not commit themselves to a decision prematurely. The grave and inevitable difficulties besetting the administration in this matter were seriously enhanced by the conduct of Mr. Clay. Seeking nothing so eagerly as an opportunity to harass the government, he could have found none more to his taste than this question of South American recognition. His enthusiastic and rhetorical temperament rejoiced in such a topic for his luxuriant oratory, and he lauded freedom and abused the administration with a force of expression far from gratifying to the responsible heads of government in their troublesome task. Apart from these matters, the United States had direct disputes of a threatening character pending with Spain concerning the boundaries of Louisiana. Naturally enough, the boundary lines in the half-explored wilderness of this vast continent were not then marked with that indisputable accuracy which many generations and much bloodshed have achieved in Europe, and of all uncertain boundaries that of Louisiana was the most so. Area enough to make 2 or 3 states more or less might or might not be included therein. Such doubts had proved a ready source of quarrel, which could hardly be assuaged by General Jackson marching about in unquestionable Spanish territory, seizing towns and hanging people after his lawless, ignorant, energetic fashion. Mr. Adams' chief labor, therefore, was by no means of a promising character, being nothing less difficult than to conclude a treaty between enraged Spain and the rapacious United States, where there was so much wrong and so much right on both sides, and such a wide obscure realm of doubt between the two, that an amicable agreement might well not seem only beyond expectation, but beyond hope. Many and various also were the incidental obstacles in Mr. Adams's way. Not the least lay in the ability of Don Onis, the Spanish minister and ambassador well selected for his important task, and whom the American thus described: cold, calculating, wily, always commanding his own temper, proud because he is a Spaniard, but supple and cunning, accommodating the tone of his pretensions precisely to the degree of endurance of his opponent, bold and overbearing to the utmost extent to which it is tolerated, careless of what he asserts or how grossly it is proved to be unfounded. His morality appears to be that of the Jesuits as exposed by Pascal. He is laborious, vigilant, and ever attentive to his duties, a man of business and of the world. Fortunately, this so dangerous negotiator was hardly less anxious than Mr. Adams to conclude a treaty. Yet he too had his grave difficulties to encounter. Spanish arrogance had not declined with the decline of Spanish strength, and the concessions demanded from that ancient monarchy by the upstart republic seemed at once exasperating and humiliating. The career of Jackson in Florida, while it exposed the weakness of Spain, also sorely wounded her pride. Nor could the grandees 3,000 miles away form so accurate an opinion of the true condition and prospects of affairs as could Don Onis upon this side of the water. One day, begging Mr. Adams to meet him upon a question of boundary, he insisted much upon the infinite pains he had taken to prevail upon his government to come to terms of accommodation, and pathetically declared that the King's Council was composed of such ignorant and stupid nigauds, grandees of Spain, and priests, that Mr. Adams could have no conception of their obstinacy and imbecility. Other difficulties in Mr. Adams's way were such as ought not to have been encountered. The only substantial concession which he was willing to make was in accepting the Sabine instead of the Rio del Norte as the southwestern boundary of Louisiana. But no sooner did rumors of this possible yielding get abroad than he was notified that Mr. Clay would take ground against any treaty embodying it. From Mr. Crawford a more dangerous and insidious policy was to be feared. Presumably he would be well pleased to see either Mr. Adams fail altogether in the negotiation, or to see him conclude a treaty which would be in some essential feature odious to the people. "That all his conduct," wrote Mr. Adams, "is governed by his views to the Presidency as the ultimate successor to Mr. Monroe, and that his hopes depend on a result unfavorable to the success, or at least to the popularity, of the Administration, is perfectly clear. His talent is intrigue, and as it is in the foreign affairs that the success or failure of the Administration will be most conspicuous, and as their success would promote their reputation and influence, and their failure would lead to the disgrace of the Secretary of State, Crawford's personal views center in the ill success of the Administration in its foreign relations, and perhaps unconscious of his own motives, he will always be impelled to throw obstacles in its way, and to bring upon the Department of State especially any feeling of public dissatisfaction that he can. And although himself a member of the Administration, he perceives every day more clearly that his only prospect of success hereafter depends upon the failure of the Administration by measures of which he must take care to make known his disapprobation." President Monroe was profoundly anxious for the consummation of the treaty, and though for a time he was in perfect accord with Mr. Adams, yet as the Spanish minister gradually drew nearer and nearer to a full compliance with the American demands, Monroe began to fear that the Secretary would carry his unyielding habit too far, and by insistence upon extreme points which might well enough be given up, would allow the country to drift into war. Fortunately, as it turned out, Mr. Adams was not afraid to take the whole responsibility of success or failure upon his own shoulders, showing indeed a high and admirable courage and constancy amid such grave perplexities, in which it seemed that all his future political fortunes were involved. He caused the proffered mediation of Great Britain to be rejected. He availed himself of no aid save only the services of M. de Neuville, the French minister, who took a warm interest in the negotiation, expostulated and argued constantly with Don Onis and sometimes with Mr. Adams, served as a channel of communication, and carried messages, propositions, and denials which could better come filtered through a neutral go-between than pass direct from principal to principal. In fact, Mr. Adams needed no other kind of aid except just this which was so readily furnished by the civil and obliging Frenchman. As if he had been a mathematician solving a problem in dynamics, he seemed to have measured the precise line to which the severe pressure of Spanish difficulties would compel Don Onis to advance. This line he drew sharply, and taking his stand upon it in the beginning, he made no important alterations in it to the end. Day by day the Spaniard would reluctantly approach toward him at one point or another, solemnly protesting that he could not make another move, by argument and entreaty urging, almost imploring Mr. Adams in turn to advance and meet him, but Mr. Adams stood rigidly still, sometimes not a little vexed by the other's lingering maneuvers, and actually once saying to the courtly Spaniard that he was so wearied out with the discussion that it had become nauseous, and again that he really could discuss no longer and had given it up in despair. Yet all the while he was never wholly free from anxiety concerning the accuracy of his calculations as to how soon the Don might on his side also come to a final stand. Many a tedious and alarming pause there was, but after each halt progress was in time renewed. At last the consummation was reached, and except in the aforementioned matter of the Sabine boundary, no concession even in details had been made by Mr. Adams. The United States was to receive Florida, and in return only agreed to settle the disputed claims of certain of her citizens against Spain to an amount not to exceed $5,000,000, while the claims of Spanish subjects against the United States were wholly expunged. The western boundary was so established as to secure for this country the much coveted outlet to the shores of the South Sea, as the Pacific Ocean was called, south of the Columbia River. The line also was run along the southern banks of the Red and Arkansas rivers, leaving all the islands to the United States and precluding Spain from the right of navigation. Mr. Adams had achieved a great triumph. On February 22, 1819, The two negotiators signed and sealed the counterparts of the treaty. Mr. Adams notes that it is "perhaps the most important day of my life," and justly called it a great epoch in our history. Yet on the next day the Washington City Gazette came out with a strong condemnation of the Sabine concession, and expressed the hope that the Senate would not agree to it. "This paragraph," said Mr. Adams, "comes directly or indirectly from Mr. Clay." But the paragraph did no harm, for on the following day the treaty was confirmed by a unanimous vote of the Senate. It was not long, however, before the pleasure justly derivable from the completion of this great labor was cruelly dashed. It appeared that certain enormous grants of land made by the Spanish king to three of his nobles, and which were supposed to be annulled by the treaty, so that the territory covered by them would become the public property of the United States, bore date earlier than had been understood, and for this reason would, by terms of the treaty, be left in full force. This was a serious matter, and such steps as were still possible to set it right were promptly taken. Mr. Adams appealed to Don Onis to state in writing that he himself had understood that these grants were to be annulled, and that such had been the intention of the treaty. The Spaniard replied in a shape imperfectly satisfactory. He shuffled, evaded, and laid himself open to suspicion of unfair dealing, though the charge could not be regarded as fully proved against him. Mr. Adams, while blaming himself for carelessness in not having more closely examined original documents, yet felt scarce a doubt that Onis did intend by artifice to cover the grants while we were under the undoubting impression that they were annulled. And he said to M. de Neuville concerning this dark transaction that it was not the ingenious device of a public minister, but une fourberie de Scapin. Before long the rumor got abroad in the public prints in the natural shape of a malignant distortion, and Mr. Adams was compelled to see with chagrin his supposed brilliant success threatening to turn actually to his grave discredit by reason of this unfortunate oversight. What might have been the result had the treaty been ratified by Spain can only be surmised. But it so befell, happily enough for the United States and for Mr. Adams, as it afterward turned out, that the Spanish government refused to ratify. The news was, however, that they would forthwith dispatch a new minister to explain this refusal and to renew negotiations. For his own private part, Mr. Adams strove to endure this buffet of unkindly fortune with that unflinching and stubborn temper, slightly dashed with bitterness, which stood him in good stead in many a political trial during his hard-fighting career. But in his official capacity he had also to consider and advise what it behooved the administration to do under the circumstances. The feeling was widespread that the United States ought to possess Florida, and that Spain had paltered with us long enough. More than once in cabinet meetings during the negotiation the Secretary of State, who was always prone to strong measures, had expressed a wish for an act of Congress authorizing the executive to take forcible possession of Florida and of Galveston in the event of Spain refusing to satisfy the reasonable demands made upon her. Now, stimulated by indignant feeling, his prepossession in favor of vigorous action was greatly strengthened, and his counsel was that the United States should prepare at once to take and hold the disputed territory, and indeed some undisputed Spanish territory also. But Mr. Monroe and the rest of the cabinet preferred a milder course, and France and Great Britain ventured to express to this country a hope that no violent action would be precipitately taken. So the matter lay by for a while, awaiting the coming of the promised envoy from Spain. At this time the great question of the admission of Missouri into the Union of States began to agitate Congress and the nation. Mr. Adams, deeply absorbed in the perplexing affairs of his department, into which this domestic problem did not enter, was at first careless of it. His ideas concerning the matter, he wrote, were a chaos. But it was a chaos into which his interest in public questions soon compelled him to bring order. In so doing he for the first time fairly exposes his intense repulsion for slavery, his full appreciation of the irrepressible character of the conflict between the slave and the free populations, and the sure tendency of that conflict to a dissolution of the Union. Few men at that day read the future so clearly. While dissolution was generally regarded as a threat not really intended to be carried out, and compromises were supposed to be amply sufficient to control the successive emergencies, the underlying moral force of the anti-slavery movement acting against the encroaching necessities of the slave-holding communities constituted an element and involved possibilities which Mr. Adams, from his position of observation outside the immediate controversy, noted with foreseeing accuracy. He discerned in passing events the title page to a great tragic volume, and he predicted that the more or less distant but sure end must be an attempt to dissolve the Union. His own position was distinctly defined from the outset, and his strong feelings were vigorously expressed. He beheld with profound regret the superiority of the slaveholding party in ability. He remarked sadly how greatly they excelled in debating power their lukewarm opponents. He was filled with indignation against the Northern men of Southern principles. "Slavery," he wrote, "is the great and foul stain upon the North American Union, and it is a contemplation worthy of the most exalted soul whether its total abolition is or is not practicable. A life devoted to the emancipation problem would be nobly spent or sacrificed." He talks with much acerbity of expression about the slave drivers and the flagrant image of human inconsistency presented by men who had the Declaration of Independence on their lips and the merciless scourge of slavery in their hands. Never, he says, since human sentiments and human conduct were influenced by human speech, was there a theme for eloquence like the free side of this question. Oh, if but one man could arise with a genius capable of comprehending and an utterance capable of communicating those eternal truths that belong to this question, to lay bare in all its nakedness that outrage upon the goodness of God, human slavery. Now is the time, and this is the occasion upon which such a man would perform the duties of an angel upon earth. Before the abolitionists had begun to preach their great crusade, this was strong and ardent language for a statesman's pen. Nor were these exceptional passages. There is much more of the same sort, at least equally forcible. Mr. Adams notes an interesting remark made to him by Calhoun at this time. The great Southern chief, less prescient than Mr. Adams, declared that he did not think that the slavery question would produce a dissolution of the Union, but if it should, the South would be from necessity compelled to form an alliance offensive and defensive with Great Britain. End of Chapter 2A. Recording by Jesse Crisp Sears in Pittsboro, North Carolina. Chapter 2B of John Quincy Adams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. John Quincy Adams by John T. Morse. Chapter 2B. Concerning a suggestion that civil war might be preferable to the extension of slavery beyond the Mississippi, Adams said, "This is a question between the rights of human nature and the Constitution of the United States," a form of stating the case which leaves no doubt concerning his ideas of the intrinsic right and wrong in the matter. His own notion was that slavery could not be got rid of within the Union, but that the only method would be dissolution, after which he trusted that the course of events would in time surely lead to reorganization upon the basis of universal freedom for all. He was not a disunionist in any sense, yet it is evident that his strong tendency and inclination were to regard emancipation as a weight in the scales heavier than the Union if it should ever come to the point of an option between the two. Strangely enough, the notion of a forcible retention of the slave states within the Union does not seem to have been at this time a substantial element of consideration. Mr. Adams acknowledged that there was no way at once of preserving the Union and escaping from the present emergency save through the door of compromise. He maintained strenuously the power of Congress to prohibit slavery in the territories, and denied that either Congress or a State government could establish slavery as a new institution in any State in which it was not already existing and recognized by law. This agitation of the slavery question made itself felt in a way personally interesting to Mr. Adams by the influence it was exerting upon men's feelings concerning the still pending and dubious treaty with Spain. The South became anxious to lay hands upon the Floridas and upon as far-reaching an area as possible in the direction of Mexico, in order to carve it up into more slave states. The North, on the other hand, no longer cared very eagerly for an extension of the Union upon its southern side. Sectional interests were getting to be more considered than national. Mr. Adams could not but recognize that in the great race for the presidency, in which he could hardly help being a competitor, The chief advantage which he seemed to have won when the Senate unanimously ratified the Spanish treaty had almost wholly vanished since that treaty had been repudiated by Spain, and was now no longer desired by a large proportion of his own countrymen. Matters stood thus when the new Spanish envoy Vives arrived. Other elements, which there is not space to enumerate here, besides those referred to, now entering newly into the state of affairs, further reduced the improbability of agreement almost to hopelessness. Mr. Adams, despairing of any other solution than a forcible seizure of Florida, to which he had long been far from averse, now visibly relaxed his efforts to meet the Spanish negotiator. Perhaps no other course could have been more effectual in securing success than this obvious indifference to it. In the prevalent condition of public feeling and of his own sentiments, Mr. Adams easily assumed towards General Vivas a decisive bluntness not altogether consonant to the habits of diplomacy, and manifested an unchangeable stubbornness which left no room for discussion. His position was simply that Spain might make such a treaty as the United States demanded, or might take the consequence of her refusal. His dogged will wore out the Spaniard's pride, and after a fruitless delay the King and Cortes ratified the treaty in its original shape, with the important addition of an explicit annulment of the land grants. It was again sent in to the Senate, and in spite of the continued systematic and laborious effort of Mr. Clay and his partisans to make it unpopular, it was ratified by a handsome majority, there being against it only 4 votes: Brown of Louisiana, who married a sister of Clay's wife; Richard M. Johnson of Kentucky, against his own better judgment, from mere political subserviency to Clay; Williams of Tennessee, from party impulses connected with hatred of General Jackson; and Trimble of Ohio, from some maggot of the brain. 2 years had elapsed since the former ratification, and no little patience had been required to await so long the final achievement of a success so ardently longed for, once apparently gained, and anon so cruelly thwarted. But the triumph was rather enhanced than diminished by all this difficulty and delay. A long and checkered history, wherein appeared infinite labor, many a severe trial of temper, and hard test of moral courage, bitter disappointment, ignoble artifices of opponents, ungenerous opposition growing out of unworthy personal motives at home, was now at last closed by a chapter which appeared only the more gratifying by contrast with what had gone before. Mr. Adams recorded, with less exultation than might have been pardonable, the utter discomfiture of all the calculators of my downfall by the Spanish negotiation, and reflected cheerfully that he had been left with credit rather augmented than impaired by the result, credit not in excess of his deserts. Many years afterwards, in changed circumstances, an outcry was raised against the agreement which was arrived at concerning the southwestern boundary of Louisiana. Most unjustly it was declared that Mr. Adams had sacrificed a portion of the territory of the United States. But political motives were too plainly to be discerned in these tardy criticisms, and though General Jackson saw fit, for personal reasons, to animadvert severely upon the clause establishing this boundary line, yet there was abundant evidence to show not only that he, like almost every one else, had been greatly pleased with it at the time, but even that he had then upon consultation expressed a deliberate and special approval. The same day, February 22, 1821, closed, says Mr. Adams, 2 of the most memorable transactions of my life. That he should speak thus of the exchange of ratifications of the Spanish treaty is natural, but the other so memorable transaction may not appear of equal magnitude. It was the sending in to Congress of his report upon weights and measures. This was one of those vast labors involving tenfold more toil than all the negotiations with Onis and Vivas, but bringing no proportionate fame, however well it might be performed. The subject was one which had occupied for the last 60 years many of the ablest men in Europe, and to which all the power and all the philosophical and mathematical learning and ingenuity of France and Great Britain had during that period been incessantly directed. It was fairly enough described as a fearful and oppressive task. Upon its dry and uncongenial difficulties Mr. Adams had been employed with his wonted industry for upward of 4 years. He now spoke of the result modestly as "a hurried and imperfect work." But others who have had to deal with the subject have found this report a solid and magnificent monument of research and reflection which has not even yet been superseded by later treatises. Mr. Adams was honest in labor as in everything, and was never careless at points where inaccuracy or lack of thoroughness might be expected to escape detection. Hence his success in a task upon which it is difficult to imagine other statesmen of that day, Clay, Webster, or Calhoun, for example, so much as making an effort. The topic is not one concerning which readers would tolerate much lingering. Suffice it then to say that the document illustrated the ability and the character of the man, and so with this brief mention to dismiss in a paragraph an achievement which, had it been accomplished in any more showy department, would alone have rendered Mr. Adams famous. It is highly gratifying now to look back upon the high spirit and independent temper uniformly displayed by Mr. Adams abroad and at home in all dealings with foreign powers. Never in any instance did he display the least tinge of that rhodomontade and boastful extravagance which have given an underbred air to so many of our diplomats, and which inevitably cause the basis for such self-laudation to appear of dubious sufficiency. But he had the happy gift of a native pride which enabled him to support in the most effective manner the dignity of the people for whom he spoke. For example, in treaties between the United States and European powers, the latter were for a time wont to name themselves first throughout the instruments, contrary to the custom of alternation practised in treaties between themselves. With some difficulty, partly interposed, it must be confessed, by his own American coadjutors, Mr. Adams succeeded in putting a stop to this usage. It was a matter of insignificant detail, in one point of view, but in diplomacy insignificant details often symbolize important facts, and there is no question that this habit had been construed as a tacit but intentional arrogance of superiority on the part of the Europeans. For a long period after the birth of the country there was a strong tendency, not yet so eradicated as to be altogether undiscoverable, on the part of American statesmen to keep one eye turned covertly askance upon the transatlantic courts, and to consider, not without a certain anxious deference, what appearance the new United States might be presenting to the critical eyes of foreign countries and diplomats. Mr. Adams was never guilty of such indirect admissions of an inferiority which apparently he never felt. In the matter of the acquisition of Florida, Crawford suggests that England and France regarded the people of the United States as ambitious and encroaching, wherefore he advised a moderate policy in order to remove this impression. Mr. Adams, on the other side, declared that he was not in favor of giving ourselves any concern whatever about the opinions of any foreign power. If the world do not hold us for Romans, he said, they will take us for Jews, and of the two vices I would rather be charged with that which has greatness mingled in its composition. His views were broad and grand. He was quite ready to have the world become familiarized with the idea of considering our proper dominion to be the continent of North America. This extension he declared to be a law of nature. To suppose that Spain and England could, through the long lapse of time, retain their possessions on this side of the Atlantic seemed to him a physical, moral, and political absurdity. The doctrine, which has been christened with the name of President Monroe, seems likely to win for him the permanent glory of having originated the wise policy which that familiar phrase now signifies. It might, however, be shown that by right of true paternity the bantling should have borne a different patronymic. Not only is the Monroe doctrine, as that phrase is customarily construed in our day, much more comprehensive than the simple theory first expressed by Monroe and now included in the modern doctrine as a part of the whole, but a principle more fully identical with the imperial one of to-day had been conceived and shaped by Mr. Adams before the delivery of Monroe's famous message. As has just been remarked, he looked forward to the possession of the whole North American continent by the United States as a sure destiny, and for his own part, whenever opportunity offered, he was never backward to promote this glorious ultimate consummation. He was in favor of the acquisition of Louisiana, whatever fault he might find with the scheme of Mr. Jefferson for making it a state. He was ready in 1815 to to ask the British plenipotentiaries to cede Canada simply as a matter of common sense and mutual convenience, and as the comfortable result of a war in which the United States had been worsted, he never labored harder than in negotiating for the Floridas and in pushing our western boundaries to the Pacific. In April, 1823, he wrote to the American minister at Madrid the significant remark: "It is scarcely possible to resist the conviction that the annexation of Cuba to our Federal Republic will be indispensable to the continuance and integrity of the Union." Encroachments never seemed distasteful to him, and he was always forward to stretch a point in order to advocate or defend a seizure of disputed North American territory, as in the cases of Amelia Island, Pensacola, and Galveston. When discussion arose with Russia concerning her possession on the northwest coast of this continent, Mr. Adams audaciously told the Russian minister Baron Tile, July 17, 1823, that we should contest the rights of Russia to any territorial establishment on this continent, and that we should assume distinctly the principle that the American continents are no longer subjects for any new European colonial establishments. This, says Mr. Charles Francis Adams, in a footnote to the passage in the diary, is the first hint of the policy so well known afterwards as the Monroe Doctrine. Nearly 5 months later, referring to the same matter in his message to Congress, December 2, 1823, President Monroe said: "The occasion has been judged proper for asserting, as a principle in which the rights and interests of the United States are involved, that the American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintain, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers." It will be observed that both Mr. Adams and President Monroe used the phrase "continents," including thereby South as well as North America. A momentous question was imminent, which fortunately never called for a determination by action, but which in this latter part of 1823 threatened to do so at any moment. Cautious and moderate as the United States had been, under Mr. Adams' guidance, in recognizing the freedom and autonomy of the South American states, yet in time the recognition was made of one after another, and the emancipation of South America had come while Mr. Adams was yet Secretary, to be regarded as an established fact. But now, in 1823 24, came mutterings from across the Atlantic indicating a strong probability that the members of the Holy Alliance would interfere in behalf of monarchical and anti-revolutionary principles, and would assist in the resubjugation of the successful insurgents. That each one of the powers who should contribute to this huge crusade would expect and receive territorial reward could not be doubted. Mr. Adams, in unison with most of his countrymen, contemplated with profound distrust and repulsion the possibility of such a European inroad. Stimulated by the prospect of so unwelcome neighbors, he prepared some dispatches, drawn to correspond exactly with the sentiments of Mr. Monroe's message, in which he appears to have taken a very high and defiant position. These documents, coming before the Cabinet for consideration, caused some flutter among his associates. In the possible event of the Holy Alliance actually intermeddling in South American affairs, it was said, the principles enunciated by the Secretary of State would involve this country in a war with a very formidable confederation. Mr. Adams acknowledged this, but courageously declared that in such a crisis he felt quite ready to take even this spirited stand. His audacious spirit went far in advance of the cautious temper of the Monroe administration. Possibly it went too far in advance of the dictates of a wise prudence, though fortunately the course of events never brought this question to trial, and it is at least gratifying to contemplate such a manifestation of daring temper. But though so bold and independent, Mr. Adams was not habitually reckless, nor prone to excite animosity by needless arrogance in action or extravagance in principle. In any less perilous extremity than was presented by this menaced intrusion of combined Europe, he followed rigidly the wise rule of non-interference. For many years before this stage was reached he had been holding in difficult check the enthusiasts who, under the lead of Mr. Clay, would have embroiled us with Spain and Portugal. Once he was made the recipient of a very amusing proposition from the Portuguese minister that the United States and Portugal, as the two great powers of the Western Hemisphere, should concert together a grand American system. The drollery of this notion was of a kind that Mr. Adams could appreciate, though to most manifestations of humor he was utterly impervious. But after giving vent to some contemptuous merriment, he adds with a just and serious pride, "As to an American system, we have it. We constitute the whole of it. There is no community of interests or of principles between North and South America." This sound doctrine was put forth in 1820. It was only modified in the manner that we have seen during a brief period in 1823, in the face of the alarming vision not only of Spain and Portugal restored to authority, but of Russia in possession of California, and more, France in possession of Mexico, and perhaps Great Britain becoming mistress of Cuba. So far as European affairs were concerned, Mr. Adams always and consistently refused to become entangled in them, even in the slightest and most indirect manner. When the cause of Greek liberty aroused the usual throng of noisy advocates for active interference, he contented himself with expressions of cordial sympathy, accompanied by perfectly distinct and explicit statements that under no circumstances could any aid in the way of money or auxiliary forces be expected from this country. Neutrals we were and would remain in any and all European quarrels. When Stratford Canning urged, with the uttermost measure of persistence of which even he was capable, that for the suppression of the slave trade some such arrangement might be made as that of mixed tribunals for the trial of slave trading vessels, and alleged that diverse European powers were uniting for this purpose, Mr. Adams suggested as an insuperable obstacle the general extra-European policy of the United States, a policy which they had always pursued as best suited to their own interests, and best adapted to harmonize with those of Europe. This policy had also been that of Europe, which had never considered the United States as belonging to her system. It was best for both parties that they should continue to do so. In any European combination, said Mr. Adams, in which the United States should become a member, she must soon become an important power, and must always be, in many respects, an uncongenial one. It was best that she should keep wholly out of European politics, even of such leagues as the one for the suppression of the slave trade. He added that he did not wish his language to be construed as importing an unsocial or sulky spirit on the part of the United States, for no such temper existed. It had simply been the policy of Europe to consider this country as standing aloof from all European federations, and in this treatment we had acquiesced because it fell in with our own policy. In a word, Mr. Adams by his language and actions established and developed precisely that doctrine which has since been adopted by this country under the doubly incorrect name of the Monroe Doctrine, a name doubly incorrect because even the real Monroe Doctrine was not an original idea of Mr. Monroe, and because the doctrine which now goes by that name is not identical with the doctrine which Monroe did once declare. Mr. Adams' principle was simply that the United States would take no part whatsoever in foreign politics, not even in those of South America, save in the extreme event, eliminated from other things possible in this generation, of such an interference as was contemplated by the Holy Alliance, and that, upon the other hand, she would permit no European power to gain any new foothold upon this continent. Time and experience have not enabled us to improve upon the principles which Mr. Adams worked out for us. Mr. Adams had some pretty stormy times with Mr. Stratford Canning, the same gentleman who in his later life is familiar to the readers of Kinglake's History of the Crimean War as Lord Stratford de Redcliffe, or Elchi. That minister's overbearing and dictatorial deportment was afterward not out of place when he was representing the protecting power of Great Britain in the court of the sick man. But when he began to display his arrogance in the face of Mr. Adams, he found that he was bearding one who was at least his equal in pride and temper. The naive surprise which he manifested on making this discovery is very amusing, and the accounts of the interviews between the two are among the most pleasing episodes in the history of our foreign relations. Nor are they less interesting as a sort of confidential peep at the asperities of diplomacy. It appears that besides the composed and formal dignity of phrase which alone the public knows in published state papers and official correspondence, there is also an official language of wrath and retort not at all artificial or stilted, but quite homelike and human in its sound. One subject much discussed between Mr. Adams and Mr. Canning related to the English propositions for joint efforts to suppress the slave trade. Great Britain had engaged with much vigor and certainly with an admirable humanity in this cause. Her scheme was that each power should keep armed cruisers on the coast of Africa, that the warships of either nation might search the merchant vessels of the other, and that mixed courts of joint commissioners should try all cases of capture. This plan had been urged upon the several European nations, but with imperfect success. Portugal, Spain, and the Netherlands had assented to it. Russia, France, Austria, and Prussia had rejected it. Mr. Adams's notion was that the ministry were, in their secret hearts, rather lukewarm in the business, but that they were not so pressed by the party of the saints in Parliament that they were obliged to make a parade of zeal. Whether this suspicion was correct or not, it is certain that Mr. Stratford Canning was very persistent in the presentation of his demands, and could not be persuaded to take no for an answer. Had it been possible to give any more favorable reply, no one in the United States in that day would have been better pleased than Mr. Adams to do so. But the obstacles were insuperable. Besides the undesirability of departing from the extra-European policy, the mixed courts would have been unconstitutional and could not have been established even by an act of Congress, while the claims advanced by Great Britain to search our ships for English-born seamen in time of war utterly precluded the possibility of admitting any rights of search whatsoever upon her part even in time of peace for any purpose or in any shape. In vain did the Englishman reiterate his appeal. Mr. Adams as often explained that the insistence of England upon her outrageous claim had rendered the United States so sensitive upon the entire subject of search that no description of right of that kind could ever be tolerated. All concession of principle, he said, tended to encourage encroachment, and if naval officers were once habituated to search the vessels of other nations in time of peace for one thing, they would be still more encouraged to practice it for another thing in time of war. The only way for Great Britain to achieve her purpose would be to bind herself by an article as strong and explicit as language can make it, never again in time of war to take a man from an American vessel. This, of course, was an inadmissible proposition, and so Mr. Stratford Canning's incessant urgency produced no substantial results. This discussion, however, was generally harmonious. Only once in its earlier stages Mr. Adams notes a remark of Mr. Canning, repeated for the second time, and not altogether gratifying. He said, writes Mr. Adams, that he should always receive any observations that I may make to him with a just deference to my advance of years over him. This is one of those equivocal compliments which, according to Sterne, a Frenchman always returns with a bow. It was when they got upon the matter of the American settlement at the mouth of the Columbia River that the two struck fire. Possession of this disputed spot had been taken by the Americans, but was broken up by the British during the War of 1812. After the declaration of peace upon the status ante bellum, a British government vessel had been dispatched upon the special errand of making formal return of the port to the Americans. In January, 1821, certain remarks made in debate in the House of Representatives, followed soon afterwards by publication in the National Intelligencer of a paper signed by Senator Eaton, led Mr. Canning to think that the government entertained the design of establishing a substantial settlement at the mouth of the river. On January 26th he called upon Mr. Adams and inquired the intentions of the administration in regard to this. Mr. Adams replied that an increase of the present settlement was not improbable. Thereupon Mr. Canning dropped the air of easy familiarity which had previously marked the intercourse between the two, and, assuming a tone more peremptory than Mr. Adams was disposed to endure, expressed his great surprise. Mr. Adams, with a corresponding change of tone, expressed equal surprise both at the form and substance of his address. Mr. Canning said that he conceived such a settlement would be a direct violation of the article of the Convention of 20th October, 1818. Mr. Adams took down a volume, read the article, and said, "Now, sir, if you have any charge to make against the American government for a violation of this article, will you please to make the communication in writing?" Mr. Canning retorted with great vehemence, "And do you suppose, sir, that I am to be dictated to as to the manner in which I may think proper to communicate with the American government?" I answered, "No, sir, we know very well what are the privileges of foreign ministers, and mean to respect them. But you will give us leave to determine what communications we will receive and how we will receive them, and you may be assured that we are as little disposed to submit to dictation as to exercise it." He then, in a louder and more passionate tone of voice, said, "And am I to understand that I am to be refused henceforth any conference with you upon the subject of my mission?" "Not at all, sir," said I. My request is that if you have anything further to say to me upon this subject, you would say it in writing; and my motive is to avoid what, both from the nature of the subject and from the manner in which you have thought proper to open it, I foresee will tend only to mutual irritation and not to an amicable arrangement." With some abatement of tone, but in the same peremptory manner, he said, "Am I to understand that you refuse any further conference with me on this subject?" I said, "No; but you will understand that I am not pleased either with the grounds upon which you have sought this conference, nor with the questions which you have seen fit to put to me." Mr. Adams then proceeded to expose the impropriety of a foreign minister demanding from the administration an explanation of words uttered in debate in Congress, and also said that he supposed that the British had no claim to the territory in question. Mr. Canning rejoined, and referred to the sending out of the American ships at the War of Ontario in 1817 without any notice to the British minister then Mr. Bagot at Washington, speaking in a very emphatic manner, and as if there had been an intended secret expedition, which had been detected only by the vigilance and penetration of the British minister. I answered, "Why, Mr. Bagot did say something to me about it, but I certainly did not think him serious, and we had a good humored laughing conversation on the occasion." Canning, with great vehemence, "You may rely upon it, sir, that it was no laughing matter to him, for I have seen his report to his government, and know what his feelings concerning it were." I replied, "This is the first intimation I have ever received that Mr. Bagot took the slightest offence at what then passed between us, and you will give me leave to say that when he left this country" here I was going to add that the last words he said to me were words of thanks for the invariable urbanity and liberality of my conduct and the personal kindness which he had uniformly received from me, but I could not finish the sentence. Mr. Canning, in a paroxysm of extreme irritation, broke out, "I stop you there. I will not endure a misrepresentation of what I say. I never said that Mr. Bagot took offence at anything that had passed between him and you, and nothing that I said imported any such thing." Then added in the same passionate manner, "I am treated like a schoolboy." I then resumed, "Mr. Canning, I have a distinct recollection of the substance of the short conversation between Mr. Bagot and me at that time, and it was this." "No doubt, sir," said Canning, interrupting me again, "no doubt, sir, Mr. Bagot answered you like a man of good breeding and good humor." Chapter 2b. Recording by Jesse Crisp Sears in Pittsboro, North Carolina.